This week, we speak with Marc Tremsal from Datadog about detecting threats and avoiding misconfigurations in the age of cloud. In the news segment, we talk about a Docker escape, secrets that lurk in the GitHub landscape, researchers who circumnavigate the Azure sphere to bend kernel memory out of shape, then some DevOps and CISO ideas to ensure AppSec isn't just duct tape, and more. Stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Today, cybercriminals are taking advantage of an expanded attack surface to commit malicious activities ranging from hijacking user accounts to making fraudulent purchases. Businesses need solutions that can protect their sites from this increase in fraudulent activity. reCAPTCHA Enterprise is a frictionless fraud detection service that leverages our experience from more than a decade of defending the internet with reCAPTCHA and data for our network of 4 million sites. To learn more about how reCAPTCHA can defend your website or mobile application against fraudulent activity, visit securityweekly.com/reCAPTCHA. With 84% of cyber attacks targeting the application layer, securing your software is more challenging than ever. Synopsys enables DevSecOps with a portfolio of industry-leading tools including Coverity, Black Duck, and Seeker to help you build secure, high-quality software faster. Synopsys is the leader in application security testing. Visit securityweekly.com/synopsys to learn more. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM.
Welcome to Application Security Weekly. This is episode 120, recorded August 31st, 2020. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with Matt Alderman. Hello, Matt.
Good morning. Happy Monday. Yes, it has gotten chilly in Colorado, which is why I have my zippy on.
So you're probably down to San Francisco summer weather, I suppose, then, at this point. Yes.
Yeah, maybe.
We also... Well, let's see. John Kinsella is with us as well. How are things up in your neck of the woods there, John?
Doing good. We're a little on the cooler side today. We're still expecting some heat in Seattle, but what really gets me is the humidity. So as long as I can avoid that, I'm happy camper.
That's good.
Yeah, we don't know
Join
what
us all
humidity
for
is
the
in
Security
Colorado,
Weekly
guys.
mailing list. A little bit too high, yes. Speaking of elevation, of course, is what I meant there. Join the Security Weekly mailing list for webcast and virtual training announcements and to receive your personal invite to our Discord server. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe and click the button to join the list. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review suggestions monthly and we'll reach out to you once reviewed. Marc is a director of product management at Datadog with over 10 years of experience building products for security and engineering organizations at Fortune 500 companies. Hello, Marc, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We're glad to have you here. And one of the things that stands out to me with Datadog is that not only are you applying monitoring, visibility, observability into the cloud, but you're also a cloud native. You're building from the ground up as cloud native as well. So I think those are two interesting angles to be understanding your customer base, I suppose.
Oh, that's very true. So it's interesting to see the latest batch of tech companies being built in the cloud from the start. I think it does, help a lot when it comes to understanding what's happening in the industry. I mean, to some extent, we have to make sure that what's going to work for our customers is, first of all, like working for ourselves. There's a whole lot of dog fooding some of the new products.
Indeed. And I think a lot of that too is that just natural monitoring, logging of events in the cloud are kind of necessary just for teams to understand the health of their application. Is it up and running? Is it running well? Is there a bug that we accidentally introduced in the last release? But all of that logging and monitoring, as much as that's for the health of the app, that also ties into security teams as well, because they want to know what's going on. But I'm curious, is those two different audience that call it the DevOps team or maybe the security team, are they looking at different types of events really when they're looking at visibility in the cloud, or what's that overlap of events between the two?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. From where I stand, at least, it looks like at the end of the day, like security, visibility, and observability, it's just about understanding how the systems behave. And so a lot of the end goal is similar. And certainly the way you collect a lot of that data is also similar. But the kind of insights that you derive from that, they're pretty different for the different audiences. A lot of on the DevOps side, a lot of the issues, they tend to be these more significant trends, right? You can look at what's happening in bulk. That's going to be impactful for a large portion of customers, even if it's very well located. Maybe it's just a single country, a very specific path, but it's still going to be a bit more visible. Whereas I think a lot of the detection logic on the security side tends to be more like the needle in the haystack. So how you use the data is definitely a bit different, but the same need for visibility is how a lot of these conversations start, I would say.
Well, and maybe let's talk a little bit more about what that actual visibility means, because I think there's perhaps a misperception that if we're logging some data and we log even more data and then we log 10 times that amount of data, just more data doesn't necessarily give us insights. So what do you see as that approach? Should I, as a DevOps team, just be logging everything as much as possible? Does that help? Or what's a good strategy of approaching that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think a lot of this conversation also start from a point of value, right? It's not so much that teams are getting drowned in the data. I mean, they're getting drowned in alerts in cases, but it's oftentimes that just collecting absolutely everything is either expensive or there are performance considerations. At least on the DevOps side, a lot of that has gone away to some extent, where now we have ways, like we have the technology to actually collect a lot of the data. Specifically with Datadog, what we end up doing is we actually decouple the ingestion from the indexing, so that we still get everything. We don't force customers to ask that question of what's valuable in terms of collection at the time when they deploy agents and so on. We let them do that on the back end after the processing, and we just try to make sure they can change their minds very easily. I think if you're building your own certainly pipeline and you have a smaller team, then obviously you know what to collect, what you want to be scaling for and paying for in various ways. That's still very much a challenge nowadays.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I guess, I'm going to make a guess that the complexity of access controls in any of the cloud environments, that's definitely something to log because it's easy to get wrong. Misconfigurations, something that's easy to get wrong. But I think one of the things you were saying there too is that rather than prescribe of what data is going to be valuable, go ahead and ingest everything. And then different customers may find different signals, different indicators more valuable to them. And so make it possible to pull that information out. And rather than say, oops, we forgot to log that, you can say, where did we log that? And then go pull it from there.
Absolutely. Think about forensics, or just an auditor showing up, right? And he's asking what happened 6 months ago. Maybe at that time that was in the debug log, you didn't think that was useful. And being able to, knowing that you logged it, that it's been processed, cleaned up, it's ready to be pulled back into the app, that's super valuable. Now, does it mean you wanted to keep that in hot storage for 6 months? Maybe not. Right. So I think both with commercial products and open source tools, you end up seeing two main use cases for a lot of these new pipelines for security logging. One is real-time collection and analysis of absolutely everything, where you don't try to fine-tune what should get analyzed. You just send everything, analyze everything. And at the same time, because you're going to have this need for very long-term, completely ad hoc queries, usually you see that complemented by a data warehouse or some kind of BI product. So on the alerting pipeline side, like for the first thing, for an open source product might be something like Stream Alert, and I think that was born at Airbnb. And the data warehouse side might be, let's say you're in AWS, that could be Redshift, for example, or even Athena over a Firestore directly in S3. So it's interesting to see that both of these things were one big product initially, and now the two use cases are maybe being split because of that point that you mentioned, which is if you want the best of both worlds, you want just paying a lot of money and having very hard time scaling everything. And most teams, they'd rather have the specific value at that point in time and the guarantee that there's very long-term availability and retention for the audit, for forensics, and so on.
Yeah, and you were starting to talk about like the real-time streaming as well as other types of logs that might be generated. I'm kind of curious too if there's two different angles we could go here. One is just, does the cloud actually make it easier to log these events from your perspective, just as you were building in there? I'm curious, is there now like a normalized format, a standardized format, just because everybody's using the cloud, or are there 3 different formats, one for each of the major cloud providers, something like that?
Yeah, I think way more than 3. 3 cloud providers are so very different, but even given a specific cloud provider, especially AWS is famous for that, right? Like each service is developed by a very independent team, and that means that they have a lot of liberty to iterate, which is great. They tend to be very customer focused, which is fantastic. You do see something happen where a lot of the logging and a lot of these like transversal decisions from an architecture standpoint, maybe they're a bit more difficult, right? And so you have very flexible schemas, definitely not always a ton of alignment. And because you also have so many services, just compute, right? It's not just VMs, it's also 3 different ways to run containers, and also on top of Kubernetes and so on. And then you have serverless. And really every flavor ends up having its own take on what to log and how. And so I would say that's definitely the price you end up paying, is some of that complexity and needing the expertise to understand. Well, I mean, if we're talking about threat detection, how to detect a specific technique, that might be not just specific to a cloud provider, but to an actual service and how it logs things. So definitely there's a bit of a price to pay there in terms of complexity.
Do you have then a short list where there are blind spots in particular, using AWS as an example? Some of the services don't have actually a particular event that they log to a degree of accuracy or a degree of detail that would be helpful and from a forensics perspective, or even conversely, that detail's present and you would always focus it on this 1 or 2 types of things. For example, I mentioned like IAM or misconfigurations. Are there other types of logging that you're always like, please make sure if you log nothing else, log in this area?
I think that's true. Although the team at AWS, they tend to be very responsive to updating that. But there's, I follow Scott Piper, and every once in a while there's a complaint about a specific data point not being available and so on, and that's changing really fast. But yeah, there's always a small gap between new services being shipped or new features being added and the kind of visibility you have through logs, through metrics, through any form of observability. It's a very fast-moving target in a way.
Yeah, and if it's challenging for you as a vendor, right? I mean, think about the customer side of this. How many new services has Amazon released in the last couple of years, right? Keeping up with those, but then also keeping up with all the things that I can and can't quite log yet, and all the iterations. I mean, that's a huge challenge for organizations to really understand what can they get visibility into and what can't they.
It's really quite overwhelming. I agree. And I mean, for us, it's our day job, right? So we have these partnerships with the cloud providers and we know what's going to come out. We can make sure it's supported on day one. And certainly it's work, but it's kind of what we do. The As a small team, especially a security team, I imagine it can be a bit frustrating to see some of the new features that maybe you were building around suddenly being shipped, and just thinking about also the potential blind spots that you can have just by virtue of some new service being used before you fully understand, how to use that safely, how to configure it well. I mean, some services are pretty well known for having very significant food guns, right? Where, yes, absolutely, the services themselves are secure. After all, they're delivered by companies with some of the best funded and, most expert security teams in the world. You still need to know how to use them and how to configure them so that, you don't open the door by accident. And it's not trivial, especially now that that's a responsibility for all developers and operations, not just one team doing kind of a central review of everything that is getting provisioned.
Yeah, when you think about the buyer for a second, we were talking about this last week. It's a conversation I constantly have. And you think about DevOps and this concept of DevSecOps. I mean, are the primary buyers the DevOps teams because they want to understand how the application's performing in production? Is it security, or is it a combination of both? Who leads with the need to get that visibility, and then does one team kind of help educate the other team?
I think that's a fantastic question. I think if you ask that question maybe even like 3-4 years ago, you get a very different answer. And certainly, I work at Datadog, right? So my answer is based on the companies I talk to. Usually, these big enterprise customers, they are going to migrate to the cloud, and observability is going to be an absolute priority, right? Because even if you want to go live with the service, you need to know what's happening. You need to get ahead of potential outages and make sure the team can be on call and so on. Usually that leads in terms of like awareness, right? So there's a request for how can we understand these very complex services, especially when developers are moving quite fast with them. And then maybe a little bit later, either the cloud architect or the VP of infrastructure, they have this security awareness and they're going to start asking about that. Or the security team, especially if it's on-prem, there's a SOC and so on, they're going to ask, hey, can I use some of that data that you have to also do my job? But I would say it depends from company to company. It definitely varies a lot, but in general, you need observability to run things. Whereas I think it's a bit more, usually the security conversation starts just a tiny bit later. And so in terms of the buyer, that means you end up seeing, at least from our side, a VP of infrastructure or someone like that looking to consolidate how they get that visibility for both DevOps and security use cases. And can I kill two birds with one stone? And can I address both needs at once? And so I would say the buyer here is a bit different from some of the more traditional security use cases. But at least that's what we're seeing. And I'm sure, if you ask a different vendor, maybe a more traditional vendor that is more reliant on like top-down CISO sales. Maybe they're seeing something different, but for us, it's always like very bottom up. It's always engineers adopting the product. And so it ends up being, VP of infrastructure, CTO, someone like that, maybe 60-70% of the time at least.
That's great, because I think that's what other people have to realize is that the development teams and the DevOps teams are deploying some of these tools, right? And they can also provide visibility into the security use case, maybe before the security folks even have the conversation. And like you said, the security conversation usually happens just a little bit after the DevOps, which means, the train is out of the station in some respects, is that some of the tooling's already been reviewed and kind of solidified. How then do I take those tools and integrate them into some of my security use cases to leverage the data that the development and the DevOps teams have already gathered?
Yeah, absolutely. And oftentimes it's not just, okay, you guys have the data, can I also leverage it? Although that's definitely happening, right? Especially when you think about modern observability being a lot more than logs, right? You have things like distributed tracing, where you can see an end-to-end transaction across distributed services, and who made the request, the parameters, did it hit the database, and what did it return, like all throughout all the way, right? And you see time series and very detailed granular information, like stored for 15 months and more, like for pretty cheap. So I think it's definitely, you see security teams look at the data and think, oh, wow, maybe I can use that. That seems very useful. But I would say the more interesting conversation that we see is security team thinking, okay, this is a very complex environment. Also, it's moving very fast. To be successful, I'm going to need developers and operations to have skin in the game. Like, they need to care about security. I need to figure out how I can empower them to secure their own services and be a bit on the front lines, right? And you can't easily ask them to adopt a brand new tool chain and brand new processes, right? You need to find them where they already work. And I think more than the tool consolidation aspect, that tends to be what goes into that conversation, is what are they using today? Can I embed some of that security visibility, the detection, like investigation capabilities into that, so that I have more buy-in from the rest of the engineering organization? Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we talk about it all the time. If you're going to provide the data, provide it back into the tools that the developers and the DevOps teams are using. Otherwise, they're not going to use the data.
No, exactly. And I think this conversation, oftentimes it starts with, the CI/CD pipeline, for example, right? And how can I bake some of the tests there? Someone, is trying to merge a PR. I get them immediate feedback. And that's great. And that's definitely happening. It's interesting that now it's also happening in the production environment with live data, live visibility into the environment. But I guess that makes sense, right? It's very similar to what happened with the DevOps movement maybe 10 years ago, and now you see security teams going in the same direction. I mean, I love it personally. I think it's great.
I like how and especially too the aspect of that conversation starting with a need from engineering to have visibility, and then security coming out of that. I'm kind of curious too. You mentioned too, of course, dog fooding, your own systems. Did you learn anything in particular? Did something stand out as you saw your own engineering teams looking at this data and then either starting to bring in the security team for investigations, or even, as you mentioned as well, just taking the ownership and a lot of security analysis, security
Both, I would say. And I mean, certainly we have, a fantastic security engineering team, and they are providing a lot of these guardrails for the rest of the organization. But once in a while, you have a developer stumble on something that's very clearly an anomaly, is not immediately clear whether it's purely operational or whether it could have security implications or even be caused by an attacker or something like that, and looping the rest of the organization. And it's I don't know how much that was happening in the past, but seeing that happening more and more in a more transparent manner, it seems like a very valuable development. So, and to your point, it also cuts in the other direction, right? Where if the security team finds something, they're looping the person who's the expert for that specific system and understands exactly its desired, behavior and what kind of data to look at to understand whether something bad happened. So yeah, definitely a lot more collaboration we're seeing internally. I think it's also happening it's not just specific to us. It's not just dog fooding. I think it's definitely happening everywhere from what we can tell.
And I'm curious too, because a lot of times, teams are going to start off building an app first. They may have just a small DevOps team that needs a tool for visibility, and they won't even have that security team yet. That's one of the things we've been talking about here. So I'm kind of curious too, what are some ways that you'd suggest them approaching security before they make that first AppSec hire or that first security hire, just to say, we have a lot of data, maybe we should start to be concerned about X or Y or this type of attack or this type of capability?
Yeah, I maybe not so much advice, but I can talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the industry. And I think before you have the security team, you already have two profiles that are very concerned about security. You have someone who's handling the platform, the cloud, any compute platform built on top. Typically a lead SRE, and a lot of people in these teams, they are very security minded, right? And they understand the security model for these products better than pretty much anyone else. And so they'll be looking to harden those systems and also build some detection for the more obvious food guns and the more obvious attacks and so on. So that's one place where that security conversation starts even before the first hire. At the application level, it's a bit different, I would say. So typically we have engineers talk to us, maybe not so much in terms of the OWASP top 10 and vulnerabilities and so on, and they're patching, they're keeping libraries up to date. But what they tend to worry about, at least from what we can tell, is other forms of abuse, right? So credential stuffing attacks and brute force attacks and so on. And it's at least as much about protecting their own company as it is about protecting users and customers. And a lot of that is custom logic, right, that they're going to have to write based on the telemetry, the observability data they have. It's probably not going to be turnkey, but it's seen as a high priority for the organization and for the individual developers in particular. And so that's the other group that starts this conversation, definitely on the application side.
That especially that last part really stands out to me, because I think you can sort of, if you can kind of engineer your way out of certain types of classes of vulnerabilities, whether it's SQL injection, cross-site scripting, so you could just kind of say, let's take that OWASP top 10, those parts of it off the table. But that, just as you said, that credential stuffing, that brute force, things like carding, whether it's a way to abuse the application in the way it wasn't intended to function, but just take advantage of that, as well as those are also paths to monetizing an attack. So having that visibility that these even are just happening against my app is actually really useful to a security team, and hopefully equally useful to that engineering team, just so they know, oh, right, not only did we think we should be concerned, but look, we can be concerned about this over here because we didn't realize that in addition to the login authentication page where people can do some credential stuffing, there's also this other page here that we didn't think about, that the clever attackers realize we don't have rate limiting or something like that. So I just really wanted to highlight how I've seen engineering teams respond to this type of visibility and take advantage of it to find those surprising areas and better protect their application.
100%. And I would say there's also a very pragmatic operational concern, right? A lot of these attacks, they drive up cost. Also, even if you don't have something that's exposed, that's vulnerable, just the attempts might overload some back-end service that was never really designed to see any significant traffic. And so figuring out ways to detect and protect against that, such as, credential stuffing attacks. Maybe something we've seen is people doing detections against IPs that are potentially abusive and pushing that to the edge, right, to the CDN and to the WAF. And I guess these two things tend to be converging lately. We saw the Signal Sciences Fastly news from last week. But yeah, closing that loop, both to protect users and customers, the organization, and also just reduce the chances that someone who's on call is going to be woken up at night because some random support service got overloaded by a very brutal attempt to stuff passwords into the entire internet.
Yeah, or an exposed API endpoint that somebody's trying to pull a bunch of data out of or something like that you didn't expect or realize, and the next thing you know, you crater the performance of the application, right? I mean, these are all different scenarios that if you're monitoring for them in production, you can start to see them and go, oh yeah, there's an API endpoint we didn't even think about from a performance or a security perspective.
I completely agree. I mean, arguably, in these cases specifically, it's pretty likely that developers and operations are going to see it first, right? Probably they get paged right away when something like that happens. Then they loop in security, or at least they contribute to an ongoing investigation, some additional telemetry, both the causes and the impact. I mean, that's where we talk about, is it the same data? Well, especially if you talk about symptoms and identifying the source and so on, then yes, a lot of it is, right? It's the same need for visibility and a lot of the same data as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of it too is really helpful to highlight, to Matt's point as well, that the growth, the emergence of the SREs as another, call it maturity or different path for DevOps teams to go to, is giving that really good emphasis on that availability out of the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and the idea of resiliency, because you can a lot of these applications, a lot of these products can also put a cost to downtime. If we're down for this many seconds, this many minutes, it costs us this amount of revenue. And so anytime you can have that quantified impact of just a service outage, tie it back to security or just general engineering, I think that's also a great way for these DevOps teams or security teams to make a case for additional resources, whether it is in tooling and people or something else.
That's a great point. And a lot of DevOps was just that, right? It was like aligning incentives, making sure that people who are de facto responsible for availability are going to have some skin in the game, that you have a better understanding of the cost, both on people and for the company, financial cost. And this is where I think, whether you call it like DevSecOps or something else, right? But this is where that normalization of security, where you see them adopting the same engineering practices, it makes a lot of sense, right? Like you have developers and operations feeling some of that pain. You have security teams trying to address these problems at scale, developing their own services to provide guardrails. And it's really, it all goes back to, economics, right? What are the economics? How much toil and pain can I address in a scalable manner with these services? I think it's actually happening like much faster this time around with the security teams than it was with for the initial DevOps movement, maybe twice as fast from what we can see in the industry.
I think I would just kind of, my gut feelings says total agreement, partially because maybe it is because going cloud first, cloud native, like you've gone, makes it a lot easier to be scalable in the sense of managing systems, reasoning about systems through infrastructure as code, the code itself, the CI/CD pipelines. So I'm just curious, maybe one final question is, what is a scaling lesson either that you have learned building out this type of capability for customers, or sort of a scaling lesson that you heard from a lot of the DevOps teams who are getting this type of visibility and then going, oh, we didn't realize, X, fill in the blank, just because they now can see something?
I wonder what a good example could be. For us, scaling is a big part of what we do. It's just a lot easier for us to address scale as a SaaS product, across thousands and more of customers, than it tends to be for a small internal team. Obviously, one lesson that we do see is that a lot of these small teams, they build these services in-house, and that makes sense, right, at the time. And then if that becomes a business critical service because it's powering, threat detection logic, because it's what's needed to keep the business up and running, it can become a pretty big burden. The scaling especially can be quite tough. So I'd say, the lesson from where we see it is that when you factor the time and energy, we tend to see teams try to outsource that, so to speak, to a partner or a vendor, so that they can focus on their core business, or like threat detection, investigation, incident response, that kind of stuff. Yeah, I think that's the main takeaway. But again, we are a vendor, so we have a very specific angle into that conversation here.
So
Sure.
basically what you said is, people don't try this on your own at home, right? Because I mean, it can get challenging. I mean, look, I've watched traditional security vendors try to move from on-premise technologies into cloud technologies. There's a huge learning curve there. I mean, there's a lot of work that has to go into that. And the concept of scale is different when you think about on-prem devices versus cloud infrastructure. And basically what you said is, look, there are people out here that really understand this whole cloud thing, so maybe leverage them to help you ease that pain.
At least consider it, in the sense that the alternative is, it's not going to be a side job, right? It's going to be a few people dedicated to the task, hopefully experts in that domain, and it's very doable. A lot of tech companies especially do it very well. A lot of big enterprise customers have stood up these observability teams that do everything in-house. Like, it's completely possible to be wildly successful doing that, but it doesn't come free, and it does require a little bit of expertise there, and so in a lot of cases it makes sense to just go and buy it off the shelves, so to speak. But I definitely have a bit of a bias in this conversation, so I recognize that.
Well, I think it's also a very welcome informed bias, because you've given us a lot of good visibility into the topic, so to speak, as well as just some good lessons learned and some ways of that story to go from visibility needed by engineering, by DevOps teams, and how that evolves into and provides tooling for security teams once you can hire into that, or once you can have the maturity of an organization to bring that utility in. So thank you very much for that.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Marc. Well, also say thanks to Matt and John, and thanks everyone for listening. If you'd like to learn more about visibility in the cloud, visit securityweekly.com/Datadog. And now we're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week.